my camera crashed. Yeah, you're not getting any explanation. I'm reading my game plot outlines. I'm on my 12th one. Go watch the last video if you want information on that. I think I am going to have to split this up into 2 parts. Hopefully I have enough storage. If not, I'm going to have to delete some apps on my phone or try and figure out something else. I don't fucking know. Maybe split it up into 3 parts. I'm not sure. Okay, picking up where I left off in the Somber of Two. Andre then mentions how he sometimes sneaks away at night to explore, to which Joshi asks to show him some close hotspots of the city, to which he agrees. And by that I mean Joshi is showing Andre. The wording was a bit weird. Joshi is showing Andre the hotspots of his local community and things of the sort in the city. So wording was a bit weird. It's not Andre showing him, it's Joshi showing Andre. As the day comes to an end, the two become intrigued by each other's personalities and decide to meet up again. They begin hanging out more often and start coming to understand and accept how one another are, soon becoming best friends. And as the years go by, they continue to discover more about each other and themselves, getting caught up in mischievous antics, learning how to communicate better through both movement and mouth, eventually falling in love, and even having to flee for their very lives. Settings. Launceston, not pronouncing it right, Launceston, Tasmania, St. Julian's, Malta, Berkukura, Malta, St. Julian's, Malta, Lucca, Malta, Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, Ulugi, Mongolia, Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, Thimphu, Bhutan, Singapore City, Singapore, Launceston, Tasmania. Yep, still fine after 2 minutes of recording only. Year settings: 2025, 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, 2004, 2007, 2012, 2025. In the Somber of Two. Languages of the game: Maltese Italian, the Maltese form of Italian. I was wrong about this. I have to change this to Mongolian, the official language of Mongolia being predominantly Mongolian, indigenous Mongolian language. Well, the originated language within Mongolia. I had originally thought that Mongolia was primarily a Russian-speaking country, but it's not. Mainly in the north is Russian-speaking, bit of Chinese, more in the south are Mandarin Chinese, but they use the Russian Cyrillic alphabet, but the pronunciation of words is completely different. But they use the Cyrillic alphabet, the Russian Cyrillic alphabet. So Mongolian, Tibetan, Malaysian, English. Okay, so that was my 12 original, I call it, written games. All the others, and when I was still in the process of writing my 17th game, the last 2 I was going to make, my 18th and 19th, were also going to be adaptations. My 13th to 18th here my 13th to 16th are all adaptations of works by author H.P. Lovecraft. He is a problematic writer in many regards, of his white supremacy, xenophobia. I mentioned once in my second Too Much Talking Twink video, I don't think that his nationalism and racism is intrinsic to to a lot of his work. There are works of his that, yes, it is absolutely intrinsic to. Horror at Red Oak, Cats of Altar, in the Cthulhu universe, it would be the creation of N-words, the Terrible Old Man, the White Ship. Those ones are definitely heavily rooted in his racial prejudice. However, I would disagree on people, or at least logically, that I think a lot. Yes, his fear of other ethnicities and cultures came from fear of the unknown, which was driving force of his, driving fear of his. But his genre of cosmicism, I firmly do feel logically that his fear of the unknown, in terms of his writing, a lot of it very much stemmed from the existential and, well, the cosmic power, the uncertain and chaotic forces of the universe itself, of the nature of existence, and the, well, in a nihilistic sense, the meaninglessness of things, if you are a nihilist, in that regard. But I'm not going to explain much more here. Take what you, other than I'm going, in this first game, there are 2 character names I have to change. I don't think I should have taken the names from the character from his original story, because they don't. I wanted to do something. I was originally going to have it as if you can maybe guess some of the theme with my writing, has a lot of undertones of political and ideological commentary in there, and cultural issues and things of the sort. I kind of wanted to try and do something similar with this, which in essence I will somewhat as well for certain things, but I'm going to change the character's name because they're nothing like, I shouldn't have taken the character's name. I literally created my own character with influence from those characters, except changed a lot of their personality types, personality characteristics, their cultural backgrounds, and their race. I changed. I have to reread actually this story. I might have changed the main character's age, but anyway. Oh yes, and all these that I'm writing from, except for what was going to be my 19th game, which I'll talk about in a bit. When I did research to check if they were in the public domain, and the copyright had gone out from it. Even if they hadn't, I thought I could maybe, well, if I ever pitched these to, a long time ago, I thought maybe bigger motion, like studios with the ability of motion capture, and then I realized no, any studios that are more indie studios and small budget studios I would want to go more towards in relation to my communistic ideals. But most are in the public domain, as far as I'm aware. The Call of Cthulhu. Yeah. 13th game. Story. 5 years after returning from the Somali Civil War, 39-year-old Francis Thurston, I'm just using their names now, I'm going to change them, but Francis Thurston, Canadian, oh yes, and change their nationality, had been trying to mend his broken livelihood in his hometown of Windsor. Things had been out of control ever since he lost his job as a teacher years before, and was only worsened by the traumas from Somalia. Though he was highly intelligent and skilled, Francis hadn't been able to make a completely stable income, so much so that he was forced to live with some very generous relatives instead of buying his own house. But he managed to gain a job with good pay as a librarian/records keeper for a local medical university, Kittrout University. Francis had also developed comorbid PTSD from fighting, and often having terrible nightmares and even sometimes intense sleep paralysis. Though he was staying with relatives, much of his family were angered by his decision to run off and join the war, and wasn't often invited to gatherings. His own parents didn't even talk to him anymore. They had been growing apart since he was a teenager and now wanted nothing to do with him, though he no longer cared. The only person in his life that ever truly cared for him was his 81-year-old great-uncle, George Angle, Canadian, who had taught him much about the field of education, as he was a former language professor. He was the only relative who Francis trusted with personal matters, acting as more of a father figure to him. They had kept in contact with each other over the years, including while Francis was overseas, through letters and manuscripts of any personal or business relations. During and since his time in the war, George, being quite wealthy, had generously been providing him payments to help with financial problems. He'd felt awful for Francis and was furious with how most of their family had treated him. As of recent, Francis's life was relatively steady, other than his nightmares. As he continued to work duties and as he continued his work duties and personal hobbies. But when news comes out of nowhere that George had died on a business trip, his entire life takes a drastically terrible turn. Francis is stunned by what his relatives tell him, and of how absolutely no one knew about this trip beforehand. He apparently stayed at a hotel in Charlottetown on his route back home 3 weeks earlier, and whilst leaving to catch a bus, slipped down a high public staircase, breaking his neck instantly. Onlookers rushed to help, but the impact had killed him. Police investigated the scene with paramedics and begun questioning witnesses. Many said there was nothing unusual. They saw nothing unusual. However, some reported seeing a man with a needle-looking object walking suspiciously close to George as he fell. They tried getting an accurate description, but only really noted he had a hood on, obscuring his face. With no real evidence of murder and no footage taken, officers had to determine his death as accidental. Though did put a warning out of a possibly dangerous man in the area. After hearing this, Francis nearly faints from realizing that the one person who ever cared for him is gone. But his hurt quickly turns to anger as he questions why their relatives, who had known weeks before, didn't tell him about George's death sooner. Especially with the possibility of murder, though he didn't truly believe that as it made no logical sense, supposedly. A month later, Francis and his entire family attend the funeral with sadness and remorse. Different adult members take turns saying their words of solemn. First, the direct family, then the nephews and nieces, including Francis' father, and finally, the grandnephews and nieces. But before the last group can begin, the hosting priest tells everyone that, in accordance with George's will, his grandnephew Francis has been made executor of his estate and personal belongings, along with being left most of his saved money, enough to buy 2 large houses. Francis is both shocked and overcome with joy by this, while the rest of them are just shocked. He then shares his humble speech of gratitude, respect, and love for his great uncle, but is angrily interrupted by jealous attendees, claiming to have been left nothing of value, and even saying Francis somehow forged the will and bribed the priest. He tells them off as calmly as possible and reminds them that they are here to honor George and can gladly leave if not wanting to do so. A few other relatives stick up for him as well, though his parents remain silent. Francis soon begins working on George's house, primarily by himself, with only some needed help from a few sincere friends of his uncle. But sees to it that he be in charge of most of the personal things of his personal belongings. As he goes through the attic, where his research is stored, George Angel's, trying to sort things accordingly, he accidentally finds a very peculiar looking box tucked behind a bookcase, almost like it had been hidden. It's heavily sealed with 3 locks and many bolts, but seems to have 2 types of keyholes for the locks, and the box itself doesn't look like any other in the room. I'll stop shaking my foot. Francis attempts opening it to see if there's anything of importance, but it is only able to undo the bolts. He takes another look at the locks and decides to search the house for 2 keys of the same fit, and miraculously manages to find them. He finally opens the box and discovers a series of very strange and slightly creepy items inside, of which are a 12-inch, 1-foot tall clay statuette, multiple occult objects, daggers, amulets, and charms tagged with symbols, papers depicting godlike figures and ancient writings, etc., and a file containing manuscripts from George titled Cthulhu Cult. Francis is extremely puzzled, as he never knew his great-uncle to study occultism, and is quite unnerved by the many I need to change this. I put sadistic ritual tools, what he considered sadistic. Quite unnerved by the many frighteningly was quite unnerved by many of the odd ritual tools. The statuette portrays what appears to be a thin sea creature-like being with the body of a human, wings of a dragon, and head of an octopus or cuttlefish. He notices markings on the base of it, almost like a language, but of none he recognized. Francis, more than a little spooked, looks at the file and decides to read through the manuscripts to see if they can explain the strange items. The first one tells of an incident George experienced while visiting a convention in America, involving a 23-year-old sculptor named Henry Wilcox, American. The young man had come to him seeking help with a disturbing issue. All the other professors Henry talked to, none of whom I hope that dog is not in any major distress with the owner. Okay, no, it seems like they're just talking. What are we at? 17 minutes. All the other professors Henry talked to, none of whom could solve his problem, said to see him for possible answers, as he had much knowledge in... Oh. Hello, little spider. It's just waddling across the file very steadily. Okay, anyway. As he had much knowledge in psychology. He showed George an odd-looking statuette made out of clay with bafflingly strange markings, the same one from the box. The craftsmanship was amazingly smooth, and George concluded it was definitely of ancient origin. He then asked where the man got it from, to which Henry said he didn't get it from anywhere, as he made it in his sleep. George was extremely confused and thought he was joking at first, but Henry insisted he wasn't and explained what happened the best he could. He told of how he had a frighteningly nonsensical dream 2 weeks earlier that somehow caused him to build the thing. In the dream, he was floating above what seemed to be a giant stone city structure, but with terrifyingly bizarre geometry, surrounded by infinite darkness, and voices could be heard from below. As he drifted closer, he could make out what they were saying to be a jumble of unrecognizable words. It didn't even sound like a human language, but remembered it clearly and described it as, and obviously, if it was made in the game, the production crew could try and do something to alter the voice of the... Obviously, it's an inhuman language, I can't say, but any Lovecraft fans know the titular phrase, Nagu, Mingwagfen, Cthulhu, Relay, Iglagnewal, Fatag. The best I can pronounce it in a human form. The last thing he saw in the dream was something ginormous moving down in the city, then woke up to find the statuette in front of him, hammer and chisel in hand. George didn't understand any of this, or knew if he even believed Henry, but could see the man was very distraught, and after further questioning, agreed to try and help. Francis continued reading how George documented Henry's sleep experiences every visit, and soon deciding to spend a night at his family house, wherein which a violent incident happened while the man was in a delirious, trance-like state. George then began asking around local hospitals to see if any similar things had been occurring with patients, finding that there was. After reading this much, Francis decides to bring these possessions of George's home with him for studying, now highly intrigued by what exactly his uncle was doing. He later reads of Henry's sudden and unexplainable cure from his perplexing sleep disorder. He later reads of Henry's sudden and unexplainable cure from his perplexing sleep disorder. George's run-in with 44-year-old detective John LaGrasse, American, during a conference at a historic university, Miskatonic University, and a statuette of the very same creature the sculptor had carved, made from a material no one could identify. John's story of his police unit's encounter with a murderous, orgiastic cult worshipping the statuette over a huge fire and screaming inhuman noises, with the same sentence Henry heard in his dreams. Talks from the cultists of their master Cthulhu, beings known as the Great Old Ones, an underwater city named Brilliat, where Cthulhu lies dormant, and a mysterious man by the name of Erich Zann, Austrian, who's the only person that knows the meaning of their chant and plays music to something they call the nuclear chaos. Eventually, Francis begins investigating these events himself, picking up where his great-uncle left off, and slowly unravels a horrific mystery older than time itself. By revisiting George's involved acquaintances, traveling to see the 57-year-old musician/Romanian Civil War veteran Erich Zann, enduring something terrifying and otherworldly, having the same strange dreams Henry did, and reading the last notes of a 28-year-old sailor named Gustav Johansen, Norwegian, about discovering a stone island with incomprehensible geometry and something monstrous lurking beneath its depths. Settings: Charlottetown, Canada; Windsor, Canada; Nanaimo, Canada; Providence, USA; Nanaimo, Canada; Windsor, Canada; Akron, USA; Biloxi, USA; the American countryside, the American wilderness; Biloxi, USA; Akron, USA; Windsor, Canada; Buffalo, USA; Toledo, USA; Linz, Austria; Windsor, Canada; Bergen, Norway. Did I not put... Oh, wait, no, yes, I did. Yes, I did. There's more on the... Yeah. Oh, okay, I forgot. No, I put that wrong. Okay. Bergen, Norway. Vancouver, Canada. The South Pacific Ocean, which is what I forgot to add here. Windsor, Canada. Labrador City, Canada. My hands are going numb because of the cold. It's getting colder now. Year settings: 2024, 2022, 2024, 2023, 2022. Fuck. Said that wrong. Very, very wrong. Starting over: 2024, 2022, 2024, 2023, 2024, 2025, 2022, 2025, 2040. The Call of Cthulhu, adapted from The Call of Cthulhu and the music of Erich Zann by H.P Lovecraft. Languages of the game: English, German, and Norwegian plus Swedish. I had Swedish here, but I'm going to also plus the Norwegian form of Swedish. Yep. Okay. Trying to go a little faster now. I can explain the rest at some other point. The Whisperer in Darkness. 14th game, story. 30-year-old Albert Wilmarth, American, have been keeping up a very fulfilling teaching life in his hometown of Akron, working as an assistant professor at a local historic university, Miskatonic University. He was seen by many as a man with great passion towards studying cultures and religions of all sorts, sometimes being frowned upon for it, and was always eager to learn more about anything new to him. Albert maintained his position alongside 43-year-old Matthew Armitage, American, a professor of folklore and longtime good friend. They worked together on more mythological research than any other instructors at the Institute, and were notably recognized by many post-secondary schools throughout the North American continent. Their two closest colleagues, both professors of ancient literature, were 60-year-old Franklin Morgan, American, and 32-year-old Ferb Price, American, who had often helped them with linguistic pieces of their studies. Albert and Matthew mostly worked on subjects to do with ethnic legends/myths of groups of people or places, though did dabble in some historical conspiracies, whereas Franklin and Ferb handled things more on the basis of philology. Though the four of them studied hard for years to achieve their ranks, they all never gotten much of a chance for field work outside of the city, with Ferb having traveled the furthest for collecting data, for cataloging data. Opportunities for research elsewhere were rare to find, and they almost always sprang at any opportunity given within reason. In the past, Albert, in most of his off time, would frequently seek out work that suited his enthusiasm for discovery, but eventually slowed his search after prolonged, few, and uneventful trips. For years, he had even been sending flyers across the country as a sort of advertisement for his services, asking communities help for researching their legends. Matthew had many times asked their school's deanship if they could find non-local cases for him and his colleagues, to which they always refused, counting it as not of campus concern. As of recent, the four men had primarily given up on trying to get research abroad and just continued to keep their main focus on teaching priorities, until one day when a woman comes rushing into their campus sector, urgently asking for Albert, quickly finding him along with the others. She introduces herself as Engenie Akeley, American, a 40-year-old herbalist medicine maker who has traveled all the way from the mid-north of the country seeking immediate aid. They go to Frankel's office, the most private place for them to talk, and they begin asking questions. She then explains to them what's been happening at her home and why she's come. And Jenny says she lives out in the countryside on a big field covered property with a 50-year-old husband, Howie Akeley, American, a former ecologist. She then tells of how they are now experiencing something horrible and desperately need professional help. 6 months earlier, there had been flooding from some of the rivers in the area that passed through the nearby mountains. And once they began to subside, a series of unknown creature sightings had occurred, almost simultaneously. The people who lived by the mountains started frequently reporting to police about horrific-looking animals they'd found on the riverbanks, and ever since seeing them, had heard voices whispering to them at night. The cases were all strangely familiar, and eventually prompted some action from local officers, but was quickly dismissed after finding nothing unusual or dangerous, more so under the belief that it was just ridiculous superstition. When Howie soon found out of these sightings, he decided to conduct his own investigation into the matter, as it greatly intrigued him. He hadn't been involved in much of their local community's natural environment even before leaving the field of ecology, and thought it was a good chance to possibly discover a previously unseen animal species inhabiting it. And Jenny was a bit weary towards his decision, though after hearing some of the story, she was a bit weary towards his decision, though, after hearing some of the stories herself. But had always been passionate to find anything new, in nature studies as well, being one of the reasons they fell in love, and agreed to help in any way she could. We at 30, okay. How he began to regularly make hikes into the forests by the mountains close to their land, and cataloged any signs of irregularities. This continued for 3 weeks, with almost nothing noteworthy. That was until he found an extremely strange object in a clearing full of flat rocks, just beyond a large forest that connected to their property. It was shaped into an almost perfectly cut cube, but somehow curved to a rhombus-like structure. God, my wording. Curved to a rhombus-like structure. And colored by varying black and blue swirls across its surface, proportionately darker in tone. There was noticeable imprints scattered along 4 of its surfaces that looked to be markings of some kind, formed in a sentencing pattern. How he had never seen anything remotely like the object in nature before, and thought it might have been put there by someone given the odd location. As the daylight grew dimmer, he started to feel unnerved being out there alone, as if he were being watched, and decided to take the object home for research, as he was highly fascinated by it. He showed it to Jenny later that night, and she too was amazed by the immense physical abnormalities, along with its incredible color scheme. They ran different tests over the next week to see if it could be shaved, smelted, carved, and even broken, all of which seemed to have astonishingly little effect. Their experiments continued like that on the daily, with no sign of damage to the object. However, something very frightening happened on the 6th day, just as they began to try to analyze the strange markings spread across it. Whilst checking the field for predators that night, Howie swore he heard voices coming from the forest at the edge of their property, just below the mountains, and upon a closer look thought he saw something moving amongst the trees. This phenomenon persisted every night from there onward, and only intensified, with Jenny soon hearing them too. They both became increasingly paranoid as the weeks dragged on with the voices, not being able to sleep many hours because of them. The mayhem continued into the next few months. When the mayhem continued the next few months, the two frequently contemplated going to the police for help, but eventually decided not to, as they most definitely wouldn't be believed. As they most definitely wouldn't believe them, possibly even putting them in an asylum. They even thought of hiring a private investigator, but quickly realized it would cost way too much. The situation soon grew worse, as they started to notice unidentified things throughout their field, further driving their fear and sleeplessness. Howie began setting traps to catch the creatures, as Jenny made more frequent trips into town to try and find anything that could help them. She finally stumbled upon a filter. That's the problems with wording in sleep. Being sleep deprived. Stumbled upon a flyer for Albert's Research Services, and figured it was the only chance they had at solving their problem without being deemed crazy. Howie wasn't completely for the idea at first, as they would either have to send a letter, most likely waiting months for a response, or go to Albert in person, though he quickly changed his mind when one of the creatures attacked their house at night. It landed on the roof, and they tried shooting it from inside, but only managed to injure it. In the morning, they found chunks of its flesh on the house and in the yard, with a trail of strange fluid, gray in color, leading into the woods. They decided one of them would travel to Auckland and get the help they needed, while the other would stay behind and guard their property. And Jenny nominated herself to go. She packed her luggage and headed out to catch a train from Missoula, a few miles away. While at the station, she noticed a man following her along and watched her board the train, who she recognized to be 24-year-old Wilbur Whately, American, from the nearby village of Dunwich. She traveled for 2 weeks, then finally arrived in the city, and quickly managed to find the university. After hearing this, the four men take a moment to discuss Jenny's issue together and what to make of it. Although he doesn't truly believe it's monsters harassing the couple, Albert thinks they should take the opportunity and try to figure out what's really going on at their house and in their community, possibly a strange type of nocturnal animal or some highly intoxicating wild hallucinogen. They agree her fear is definitely genuine, but feel that there is a more logical explanation to the voices and so-called creatures of the mountains, and are now extremely wanting to find out. After talking it over a bit more, they finally decide to take her offer and travel up north to help solve this mystery. Matthew and Albert inform their deanship that they'll be going on a 10-month-long vacation, rightfully earned doing more than enough work for the school, and soon depart with Jenny back to her home, making a side stop along the way to get some important equipment from an acquaintance of Ferb's. They eventually reach Missoula and immediately notice that the weather conditions of the area are behaving incredibly unnatural, being quite hot with virtually no snow for the middle of winter. The group takes a cab out to the couple's property and meet Howie and learn more about the disturbances. But when they arrive at the house to meet Howie and learn more about the disturbances, but when they arrive at the house, he's in complete distress, hasn't bathed or shaved in days, and wearing ripped, dirty clothes. Albert and Jenny start questioning about what happened whilst the others tried to calm him down. Howie says that the very day Jenny left to get help, things went absolutely insane and kept worsening as the days passed with almost no relief. The voices had gotten louder and more frequent than ever before, being heard in the daytime too, and the creatures had now begun attacking the house in waves, but never actually broke in. Every night, he defended their property the best he could, with some shotguns and traps, doing so day in and day out, which quickly took a toll on his health. Howie soon learned that the voices were indeed coming from the creatures, as they started speaking clearer in his mind. The voices told him they were a telepathic extraterrestrial race who called themselves, in the human English language, the Migo. M-I-G-O, the Migo. And have been observing humanity's different behaviors from hidden bases throughout the globe, along with inhabitants of other worlds too. They came from a dark, distant planet by the name of Yuggoth, located at the farthest edge of our solar system, which they even predicted will be visible to Earthlings through telescopes in approximately 4 years from now. The creatures said they're most fascinated with humans, as they have extremely odd functions and are very interested in the emotional reaction we call fear, something they lack. The five of them tried asking Howie more questions, but he was too weak to continue, and Jenny then makes him a herbal remedy to help ease his mind and gets him into bed for some much needed rest. Albert, Matthew, Frankel, and Ferb all reflect on what he had said and were highly perplexed. They still weren't convinced of the creature's existence, but knew there was definitely something very wrong occurring. That amount of mental strain could only be caused by pure unbridled terror. The men set up God, I'm getting colder. The men set up residence at a rental house over in Dunwich and promptly began their investigation, starting with the Akeley's property. They visit with Howie, now in a more stable condition, and Jenny again to talk more about what happened to him. He says the Migo mentioned they are the loyal servants of an ancient cosmic being known as Shub-Niggurath, who lives in a giant deep hole on the coldest part of Yuggoth, and are also descendants of something they call, well, the Keeper of Ways. As for the strange object Howie found in the forest, he eventually figured that's what they want from them, and threw it into their field, hoping it would make peace. But not only did they reject it, they placed more all throughout the property. Oddly enough, though, for some reason the creatures hadn't come back to attack the house for nights since Jenny's return. The crew takes a look at the objects and are bafflingly amazed by what they see, just as Howie and Jenny were. They bring some back to their base for further analysis and start their examination of the entire surrounding area, rural and urban. And as the four men delve deeper into the startling events, they piece together haunting realizations of demonic forces living among our world. The aforementioned alien Migo creatures, the hypnotizing nighttime voices of the woods, strange wilderness rituals carried out by that Wilburman from Dunwich, an ancient cryptic book titled the Necronomicon, detailing prophecies of... Please turn. Necronomicon, dealing prophecies of the Great Old Ones and the Outer Gods, sealed portals that can be opened to a being known as Yog-Sothoth, and what lies within the high jagged mountains, all lead to unimaginable answers that human minds were never meant to know. Settings. Ooh, this is a lot. This one might have the most settings out of all my games. And I rubbed some of my lipstick. That is not what I do. Settings: the American wilderness, Akron, USA, the American countryside, the American wilderness, the American countryside, Missoula, USA, the American countryside, Missoula, USA, Akron, USA, Iowa City, USA, Missoula, USA, the American countryside, Dunwich, USA, the American countryside, Missoula, USA, Dunwich, USA, the American countryside, the American wilderness, the American countryside, Dunwich, USA, the American countryside, the American wilderness. Turn the page, please. Dunwich, USA, the American countryside, Dunwich, USA, the American countryside, Dunwich, USA, the American countryside, it's very repetitive. Yes, it's very repetitive. Am I writing with this? I'm very precise with the settings, alright? I like it, shut up. Or I did like it. Minot, USA, Dunwich, USA, the American countryside, Dunwich, USA, the American countryside, the American wilderness, the American countryside, the American wilderness, the American countryside, Dunwich, USA, the American countryside, Sacramento, USA. Year settings: 1926, 1925, 1926, 1930. The Whisper in Darkness. Open. Adapted from The Whisper in Darkness, The Dunwich Horror, The Other Gods by H.P Lovecraft. Language of the game: English. Ooh, cold. Okay. Come on. The Color Out of Space. th game. Story. 2 years after the Rwandan Civil War, 28-year-old UN peacekeeping soldier Erich Zann, Austrian, had been trying to manage a normal life in his hometown of Linz after witnessing the horrific genocide in 1994. He was continuously haunted by very intense PTSD from what he saw, sometimes not being able to sleep for nights on end, and would often down hard liquor to make his mind drift. So much so that he sadly considered himself an alcoholic. During the war, Erich had started learning how to play the viola in his free time, and upon returning home, also picked up a small kalimba from a local music store to practice with. He'd always been in love with the sound of the two instruments. Most most out of any other musical devices, even though they were polar opposites in tone. Dreaming of being able to play them professionally someday, maybe even make a career out of it. The viola was painted a glossy rustic silver color, with a smoothly trimmed body and thin steel strings. It had been given to him by his closest companion in the army while stationed in Rwanda, 36-year-old former UN peacekeeping soldier / farmer Nathanda Goliath Botswanan. The two first met on a routine training mission in Madagascar 5 years before being deployed to the war, and since then have remained best friends, even through every terrible thing they saw in the Tutsi massacre. Nathanda made the viola at their military base in Rubavu for Erich's 27th birthday, because he knew how much he loved its sound, and that he had always wanted to own one himself, never having enough time or money to buy the instrument back home. Being a highly skilled craftsman, Nathanda spent night and day working on the viola to absolute perfection, completely solo, using only materials from local retailers in the city. It was the best gift Erich had ever received, and attempted playing it every evening for the remainder of their time there, keeping the entire squadron up for weeks. He eventually learned how to control the instrument well enough, and pretty soon could sort of play a few songs, though at a very slow pace with lots of mistakes. In recent times, Erich had been put on temporary leave of absence from the United Nations Division in Austria, and was making preparations for a 3-month-long trip to visit Nathanda and his polygamous family in Botswana. He hadn't seen his friend since the end of the war, and never previously met any of his family members, whom he would talk about constantly, both in person and in writing. They had been planning this visit for years, even before being stationed together. Wait, that makes sense. Yep, it did. Yeah, for a second I thought I wrote something wrong. William's family, war, previously, okay, even before they had been stationed together, and were frequently sending each other letters on travel arrangement updates. The two agreed to meet halfway in Ivory Coast, as Nathanda would already be there to negotiate a business deal for his farm. Then hitch a boat ride down to Namibia and drive straight across into Botswana. After packing what he needs for the long voyage, Erich catches the next flight out to Yamoussoukro. Brings his viola and kalimba along for entertainment. Upon arriving in the capital city, he meets his friend at a hotel in the downtown area, being overjoyed to see each other once again. Once he gets his room in order, Erich joins Nathanda and helps him on the last business meeting for seed/livestock to bring back overseas. The two of them go on a self-tour around the local neighborhoods for some fun before departing in a few days. They talk about how much seems to have changed about them, yet still feels exactly the same, and regale fond stories of their past antics together. The happiness soon fades, though, as memories of the Civil War come up in conversation with all their painstaking details. Nathanda reminds Erich that what happened in Rwanda wasn't any of their faults, telling him they did everything possible to try and stop the slaughtering. Unfortunately, the RPF rebel troops vastly outnumbered their platoon. But nothing, he said, really eased Erich's regret, so being terrorized by dreams of the tragedy almost overnight. They soon make their way down to Abidjan, and board a cargo ship to Namibia, eventually docking in Swakopmund. Nathanda's husband, Imogeling, meets them in the city to help bring the farming goods back over the border into Botswana. After a day of driving on long desolate roads, they reach their farm in the very secluded countryside, and Thanda is relieved to finally be home with his family, just as Erich is excited to be meeting them all for the first time. The family in total consists of Nathanda, his husband, and Mogalang, two wives, Maswin and Bekanye, and two children, Babaluki and Gotsamadi. The wives and children delightedly introduce themselves, welcoming Erich into their house, along with thanking him profusely for his assistance with the supplies, much of which is hard to find in their country, in terms of the specific supplies needed, much of which is hard to find in their country. They help him settle into the room where he's able to stay, where he'll be staying. Then he relaxes by himself for a while before joining them for dinner, with Bakyani and Mogaling preparing a special dessert to celebrate his arrival. The next day, Nathanda and Moswin take Erich out for a tour of their many animal barns scattered throughout the fields, as they have quite a number of them, and also to show how much natural beauty there is on their property, if he ever wants to go explore it when getting bored. It was all absolutely enthralling to him, as the land was unlike anything he had ever seen before, right down to the reddish gold color of the dirt and rocks, teeming with unbelievable wildlife that can only be found in the heart of southern Africa. It would be near impossible for his mind to get tired in a place like this. Later that night, they all gather around sharing stories with each other, how they met, what their interests are, where they've lived, incidents in the military, etc. And once learning of his want to be a musician, the children start pestering Erich to play songs on his viola, quickly getting the adults to join in as well, which he reluctantly obliges to after minutes of hassling. Though not sounding the best, he plays a few made-up folk tunes, on the spot folk tunes, improvising his entire way through, dancing around like a raving. I've got to change that wording. Dancing around like a raving lunatic, dancing around in like very eccentric ways. Then some classical Austrian pieces with his own touch added to them. All the while, his small audience laughed and hummed along to the viola sound. The whole family was impressed by his skills, all agreeing that there was something very hypnotizing about the way he played. But Erich personally didn't think much of his talents, with the thing saying didn't think of much of his talents with the thing, saying he'll need a lot more practice before fully being able to master it. Nonetheless, it was quite enjoyable for him to perform in front of listeners for once, not having many acquaintances back home who took an interest, and decides to advance his self-teaching lessons while staying in the country instead of merely keeping the two instruments with him. I'm going to read like this. My hands in my pocket. Instead of merely keeping the two instruments with him for entertainment. Before going to bed, Nathanda thanks Erich for his little concert, then quickly slips him a few mini bottles of schnapps and white wine to help him sleep better, with the dance routine having shaken up his nerves quite a bit, though telling him to go easy on them. A month passes, and Erich is having the time of his life at the family's farm. I should probably change the types of wine. Would probably be more common. Well, yes, you can find that wine in Botswana. It's just more common alcoholic drinks that can be found there. Where was I? Sleep. A month passes, and Erich is having the time of his life at the family's farm, going exploring on their property along with getting to know the local communities with Nathanda, learning quite a lot about the area's history, from ancient tribal times to brutal English colonialization of the land into the country of Bashundaland, which was the earlier historical name for colonialized Botswana. Though feeling more relaxed than he had been in years, Erich wasn't making much progress. Though feeling more relaxed than he had been in years, Erich wasn't making much progress on mastering both his viola and kalimba, which was starting to really frustrate him, causing his drinking to become a bit more careless. But other than that, he was loving every minute of venturing out into the beautiful nature and helping the family out with any work they needed done. Until one night, when out of nowhere, a glowing object hurls out of the sky and crashes right into one of their sorghum fields on the westernmost half of their property, followed by a huge explosion of blindingly bright light, which causes the surrounding landscape to shake violently. After going deaf for a few minutes from the impact shockwave, they all immediately rush over to its landing spot to see if the animals over there are right and what exactly the object was. Upon arrival, they find all the barns thankfully still intact, but their entire sorghum supply burnt to a crisp and a huge crater with a small meteorite lying inside, right where the field it crashed into used to be. Nathanda and his family are completely horrified by the damage worth thousands of pulas, what would be in Canadian currency dollars. Pulas is the currency of Botswana, in crops. However, Erich is more so in disbelief from how cold the air feels, even though the place had clearly been on fire. Local police eventually show up in the very, very early morning to investigate the site, along with news crews and planetary scientists. Some of their closest neighbors also rush over to see the commotion. Within hours, the farm is swarmed by authorities and onlookers examining the disaster, but the family quickly gets fed up of all the people who are only coming for some excitement. To which Nathanda, Imogalang, Maswin, and Bekiani and Erich all spread out through the property, bitterly asking officers to escort them off. After a long day of unexpected stress, they sit down together to discuss everything that just happened, the children still being in a lot of shock, and what should be done. Erich decides to stay longer so he can help with any further work they have on the farm whilst they sort out their finances. Nathanda and Bakyani will make a trip over to Sirawi to get a lawyer's opinion on what they should do about the crop/land lost in the explosion, while Imogalan, Maswin, and Erich talk with the authorities regularly. God, my wording is getting so bad. Talk with the authorities regarding how long the meteor will be staying where it is. They all agree on these terms, but Maswin begins crying at the thought of how much effort had gone into making that field and what they're going to do without it, as sorghum was their most sold product out of all crops and livestock. The family tries comforting her, even though they don't know exactly what they'll do either. There's missing a word there. Nathanda and Picciani start packing for their drive the next day, planning on staying at a hotel in the city, as they estimate talking with the lawyer will take a few days. But halfway through, they're stopped by officers who tell them that while trying to chip away pieces for study, the scientists apparently unleash an extremely strange putrid gas from inside the meteor, and quickly ordered an emergency call for biohazard specialists to see if it's at all poisonous. People were reportedly smelling it across the entire property, with Erich even picking up on his foul odor on one of his walks, to a point where he almost fainted from the nauseating fumes. All on-site officers were given instructions to not let anyone leave the premises until this gas is determined safe or not, which utterly infuriates Nathanda and Moslin. The specialists arrive later that evening and begin testing the meteor for signs of toxicity, whilst the family and Erich keep themselves in the house as much as possible, forbidding the kids to leave until they know the results. A few days go by, and they're informed that the specialists still aren't able to determine if the gas is dangerous. In fact, none of them can figure out what kind of volatile substance it even is, as their tests keep failing to find a match. Thankfully, though, no one on the farm has come down with any illness from inhaling it, but the news has reached government officials, and a public advisory has been issued urging everyone in the local area to only leave their homes when necessary. This puts a mountain of stress on the family, as their farm's reputation is quickly sinking, and are now worried about who will buy from them once things are back to normal. 2 weeks pass, with the specialist still having no clue as to what the gas is, and Erich starts feeling almost completely helpless in his friend's whole situation. But Nathanda reassures him that his presence is all they need right now. Agents from DISS, Directorate of Intelligence and Security Services, which is basically like Botswana's version of, well, for Canada, the RCMP, or America, the FBI. And some government marshals eventually arrive, ordered to make sure no on-site personnel or civilians leave in an attempt to keep the farm quarantined, along with shooing away any more journalists trying to report on the incident. This enraged the family and Erich, who think it's absolutely absurd to essentially jail them on their own property over a gas that's done nothing except give off a bad smell. Demanding to know how they'll get things like food and water, the agents calmly relay that any basic needs will be provided upon request, as they are also no longer allowed to harvest any of their crops or animals for consumption, as they could be tainted, which only pisses them off further, but soon give up protesting because there's nothing they can do about it. Another month passes of being stuck in quarantine, and Erich starts becoming increasingly worried about how he's going to inform his superiors at the UN's division back home about what's happening in Botswana. As his leave of absence is almost over, he decides to try writing a letter explaining his situation, though with the amount of restrictions put in place on the property, it'll be difficult getting it mailed out, most likely not making it to Austria before his scheduled return date. At this time, a new scientist shows up at the farm with permission from high-ranking officials to conduct more thorough testing on the meteorite. 40-year-old Kazia Masuka, South African, from the South Africa Astronomic Organization's headquarters in Johannesburg. She introduces herself to Erich and the family with great enthusiasm for being given the opportunity to come and study the space debris. But but is oddly unsympathetic to the fact that it completely destroyed their most valuable crop. She sets up her equipment at once. Sets up her equipment at one of the camps. Then then immediately begins running tests on it. As she does, though, Eric and Nathanda both realize something extremely strange, baffled at how they never noticed it before. The crater left by the meteorite seems unnaturally giant compared to its actual size, and the tools being used to break pieces off didn't appear to be doing much of anything. When questioning some scientists about it, they too agree that the crash site is extremely peculiar along with the gas leaking out from somewhere inside its rocky core. One of their hammers actually shattered when trying to obtain another specimen, which was quite unnerving to them. Not long after Kazia's arrival, things slowly start to become weirder and more disturbing on the property, especially during the night. Eric begins having frighteningly bizarre dreams of himself walking through an indistinguishable blackened landscape with strangely colored figures moving about, and a deep, garbled voice